In Revenge of the Sith, there is a moment most people gloss over. Palpatine sits hunched inside a Senate pod, clutching his own throat, barely breathing. His skin is still smoking. His lungs feel like something has been wrung out of them. The medics who found him assumed the Jedi had done this to him. They were right, but they had no idea how deep that damage had actually gone. What if Palpatine's lungs burned out completely? What if the most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years needed a respirator and a life support harness to survive? Just like the broken apprentice, he was about to chain into one on Mustafar. Let's begin. The moment the Senate chamber went silent, Palpatine knew something was wrong. Not politically, not strategically, physically. He felt it in his chest, that tight and spreading burn working its way through him, with every attempted breath like fire crawling through soaked cloth. He croaked out a demand for shock troopers and gripped the edge of the floating pod with fingers that were trembling. By the time they reached him, he could barely form words. The dark side was the only thing keeping him conscious. At the Imperial Medical Facility, the droids ran their diagnostics with mechanical thoroughness. The findings were not good. The first injury, Mace Windu's redirected lightning, had scorched him from head to toe during the confrontation in his office. It had ravaged his skin, collapsed his appearance decades in a matter of minutes, and weakened tissue across his entire body. Painful, permanent, but survivable on its own. The second injury was a different problem entirely. The prolonged Force lightning exchange with Yoda, two immovable wills pouring raw dark energy into the same sustained storm, had burned his lungs and his esophagus from the inside. The first injury had done its damage to his surface. The second had done it to his core. Without a respirator, breathing was impossible. His lungs simply could not function unaided. The medical droids fitted him with a compact support harness worn beneath his robes, connected to a small respirator unit that covered his lower face. It was not the full encasing armor they had recommended. Palpatine refused the helmet. What he accepted was a close-fitting framework of reinforced plating around his torso and a mask that would have looked imposing on anyone. But on the Emperor of the Galaxy looked like something carved out of a much darker era of history altogether. The Bacta layer built into the harness's interior would work on the internal damage over time. The medics told him healing would take the better part of a year, possibly longer. He told them to leave and sat alone in the room with the low hiss of his respirator and the distant glow of Coruscant visible through the viewport. What crossed his face in that moment was not something any living being was permitted to see. Palpatine had spent 60 years constructing an image of absolute control, of a man so far above mortality that fear itself was simply one of his instruments. And here he was, breathing through a machine, being told his body had a timeline. He thought of the ancient Sith warriors who had worn armor and masks not out of vanity but out of necessity, warriors who had turned injury into iconography and made their survival look like a deliberate choice rather than a desperate one. That was the direction he needed to go. Not hiding the damage, weaponizing it. When he stepped back into the public eye, the effect was exactly what he had calculated. The Emperor was no longer the soft-spoken, slightly aged chancellor the galaxy had grown accustomed to deferring to. He was something else now. Something armored and masked and visibly marked by the battle he had survived. Adults looked away from his image on the HoloNet. Children were terrified. Even senators who had spent careers navigating the worst rooms in the Republic found it difficult to hold his gaze. The propaganda wrote itself. Here was their emperor, scarred by the very Jedi he had warned them about for years, still standing, still governing, still willing to bear the cost of their protection in his own flesh. The fear that Palpatine had always cultivated as a background condition of his rule was now visible on his face every time he appeared in public, and it was more effective than anything he had managed before. On Mustafar, meanwhile, Anakin Skywalker was burning. The shock troopers Palpatine dispatched found what remained of him and brought him back to Coruscant. The reconstruction surgery was extensive, and the suit designed for the new apprentice was built with a very specific philosophy in mind. It was not designed for healing. It was not designed for mobility or comfort or any of the things Palpatine's own harness had been built to provide. Vader's armor was oversized, heavy, and deliberately restrictive. The control box on his chest was an exposed point of vulnerability. The needles connecting his nervous system to the suit's mechanics dug into him with every movement. His breathing was loud and labored and constant, a rhythm that announced his presence and reminded everyone who heard it that the man inside was held together by a machine. That was not incidental. It was the design. Pain kept Vader angry. Anger kept him dependent, and dependence kept him useful. For the first few months, it worked. Vader was still processing the loss of Padme, still adjusting to the weight and constant agony of his new existence. He did not yet see the suit clearly. What he saw was a master who had pulled him from the edge of death, and who was, himself, breathing through a machine and carrying the marks of the same war on the same day. There was a strange and unspoken solidarity in that. Two figures who had paid a terrible price, building something new together out of the ruins of what they had burned down. Vader had never once been given something that resembled understanding before. Even if it was a performance on Palpatine's part, the feeling of it was real enough to keep the peace between them for a while. That peace did not last. The Inquisitors were a significant part of why. Palpatine had assembled them to pursue Jedi survivors across the galaxy, with the Grand Inquisitor, a former Jedi Temple guard of genuine capability, overseeing their operations while Vader retained authority over the entire program. Vader had no patience for most of them. He found the majority of the Inquisitors to be broken and opportunistic, people who had surrendered to the dark side not out of power or conviction, but out of fear, and who tried to compensate for their own inadequacy with cruelty. He told Palpatine as much, directly and repeatedly, and the conversations escalated. "If the last of the Jedi need to be found," Vader said during one exchange in Palpatine's chambers, his voice carrying the particular flatness that preceded violence in every interaction he had, "then let me go and find them. Stop filling my time managing people who have no right to call themselves warriors." Palpatine reached for his lightsaber. What followed was instructive. The Emperor had not been idle during his recovery. Unable to risk using Force lightning while his internals were still healing, he had drilled his combat forms privately, working to reclaim the technical mastery that had made him one of the most dangerous duelists in the history of the Sith. His skill was real. The problem was that the harness, even as streamlined as it was compared to Vader's armor, still imposed weight and restricted the fluid, acrobatic style that his preferred forms demanded. The precision was there. The speed was not. Vader did not require speed. His suit had taken that from Anakin long ago. What he had was mass, mechanical limbs with a crushing grip, and the kind of raw forward momentum that does not negotiate with elegance. When their blades met, it was not a duel. It was Palpatine trying to redirect a landslide. The fight ended with Palpatine on one knee, his saber destroyed, his forearm shattered. Vader stood over him and did not move to help or to finish him, just stood there breathing in the silence that followed. "You have been afraid of me since Mustafar," Vader said. "I see it now. Months of it. Every argument where you pulled back just a little. Every scolding that stopped short of what you would have done before. You never used to flinch." Palpatine, for once in his life, had nothing to say. Vader did not kill him. That was, in its own way, the most complete thing he could have done. He had Palpatine confined to a sealed wing of the old Jedi Temple, now the Imperial Palace, under full lockdown. The healing harness was removed. His communicator access was stripped down to a single channel that only Vader could receive. A small number of trusted officers knew the full truth. To everyone else, the Emperor was in private recovery, his condition serious enough to require a period away from public duties. The HoloNet carried careful updates. The Senate continued its deliberations. The machinery of government kept turning because Palpatine had built it to survive his absence, never imagining that absence would be forced on him. Into the Emperor's armor and the Emperor's role stepped Darth Vader. The impersonation was cleaner than it had any right to be. Vader's suit already concealed him entirely. His voice was already unrecognizable beneath the mask's modulation. And because Palpatine had already reintroduced himself to the galaxy in an armored, masked, and visibly altered form, the difference in build and bearing was not enough to generate public suspicion. Officers and administrators who worked in closer proximity were kept deliberately in the dark. The transition moved in 3 stages. First, rare public appearances attributed to the Emperor's ongoing recovery. Then an announcement that the Emperor would return to active governance in a modified capacity. Then, quietly, Vader was simply there, conducting affairs behind the mask with the Senate, the military, and the Imperial bureaucracy falling into line because the alternative was unthinkable. Inside the sealed wing, Palpatine had nothing to do but wait and think. The physical conditions were deliberately uncomfortable. Temperature in his chambers fluctuated without pattern. His wrist was never repaired. The Bacta lining that had been helping his internal healing was gone. He could still breathe through the small, portable respirator unit that had been left with him, because Vader wanted him alive and suffering. Not dead, but recovering was a different matter now. The dark side sustained him through the worst of it, as it always had. But it could not give him company or purpose or anything to act on. He thought that was all there was to do. What surfaced, slowly and with the particular discomfort of a man who had never once in his life entertained genuine regret, was the question of Vader's suit. Not Palpatine's own harness, his own damage, his own vulnerability. Vader's suit, the one he had designed to be a coffin that kept its occupant alive. He turned it over in his mind the way a craftsman examines a structural flaw discovered too late. He had calculated that constant pain would keep Vader manageable. It had for a while. What he had not calculated with sufficient seriousness was the endpoint of that equation. A man held in suffering long enough does not become permanently compliant. He becomes capable of anything. Palpatine had spent decades understanding fear, using it, weaponizing it, but he had underestimated what it looked like from the inside of something you cannot escape. He was beginning to understand it now. Vader, meanwhile, was discovering what it actually meant to govern. He had no interest in the Death Star, a superweapon already deep in construction by the time he took the throne. Its bureaucratic infrastructure led by men like Tarkin and Krennic, who had spent years investing their careers in it. Vader summoned them both within his first weeks and made his position clear without particular subtlety. Tarkin, perceptive enough to understand that arguing with a new emperor about his preferred methods of planetary destruction was not a survivable career choice, redirected his considerable abilities toward administering the Senate and managing Imperial loyalty across the core worlds. Krennic, who was less politically flexible, did not survive the meeting. The Death Star project was quietly defunded, and its engineering teams absorbed into military fleet development. Vader then turned his attention to Palpatine's clone phase-out policy. Canonically, Palpatine had been systematically replacing the clone army with conscripted soldiers. The clone commanders slowly pushed aside as the new stormtrooper corps expanded. Vader reversed it. The clones who had fought through the entire Clone War were not phased out. They were given proper command structures and the recognition they had earned. Conscripted Imperial citizens were moved to frontline positions instead. It was not a compassionate policy in any traditional sense. It was just a different distribution of the burden, and it changed the relationship between the Empire and its veteran military class in ways that would take years to fully understand. With the military now oriented outward toward criminal syndicates expanding aggressively through the Outer Rim, the Empire found something it had never had under Palpatine, a common enemy that was not its own citizens. Vader led those campaigns personally. He found them deeply satisfying in a way that hunting Jedi had not been for some time. The Jedi carried the weight of everything he had lost. Crime lords and pirate fleets were simply obstacles to be dismantled, and dismantling them efficiently was something he was extraordinarily good at. The Inquisitors, meanwhile, were not given a long future. Without Palpatine's symbolic investment in them, and with Vader having made his opinion of their usefulness abundantly clear, the program was wound down. Vader dismissed them from service in the first year, leaving the Grand Inquisitor in place as a reminder of institutional continuity before eventually folding the remaining Jedi hunting operations into dedicated clone units with actual combat records. It was cleaner and it worked better, and Vader did not miss the performance of managing traumatized fallen Jedi who had been costumed in Sith aesthetic and told they were powerful. Palpatine eventually reached out through the communicator Vader had left him. He had thought through his options with the clarity that comes from months of isolation and arrived at what he believed was a reasonable proposal. He wanted his harness back. He wanted his wrist repaired. He wanted freedom from the sealed wing. Not power, not influence, just the ability to exist outside of walls that were slowly wearing him down. He was willing to offer intelligence, counsel, knowledge of the dark side that no one else alive possessed. He phrased it carefully and without obvious manipulation, which for Palpatine required a significant expenditure of effort. Vader agreed to meet. They sat across from one another in the great hall of what had once been the Jedi Temple, Palpatine diminished in plain dark robes, the portable respirator unit hissing softly against his lower face, and Vader in full armor across the table with nothing in his posture suggesting mercy or nostalgia. Palpatine laid out his terms. He spoke calmly. He was almost convincing. And then he hesitated. It was brief, barely a breath's length, but it was there, that flicker behind the yellow eyes where 60 years of absolute ambition surfaced through the composure and showed Vader exactly what was underneath. Palpatine could not let go. He had built the Empire, every brick of it, and watching someone else sit on the throne he had bled for was simply beyond what his nature could accept. The words coming out of his mouth were asking for freedom. The thing behind his eyes was calculating a return. Vader had looked into enough people's faces to know the difference. The lightsaber ignited before Palpatine completed his next sentence. It was not a long fight. Palpatine brought everything he had left, and it was not nothing. It was never nothing with a man who had mastered the dark side across 7 decades of practice. But the gap that had always existed between Anakin Skywalker's physical power and Palpatine's aging body was simply impossible to close from the position Palpatine was now in. When it was over, the hall was quiet, and Vader stood in the settling dust of what had once been the heart of the Jedi Order and breathed steadily through his mask and then walked back to the throne. What followed was an empire that did not look like anyone had planned for. Without the Death Star and without the systematic internal suppression Palpatine had been quietly building, the conditions that would have eventually unified opposition into something coherent never fully crystallized. The groundwork for rebellion still existed. Order 66 had happened. The Republic was gone. Military occupation was a daily reality across dozens of systems. People with genuine grievances were still out there, and some of them were still organizing. But without the Empire targeting its own citizens with the focused cruelty Palpatine had intended, the fragmented resistance cells that would eventually have coalesced into a single rebel alliance never found the shared urgency or the unified cause that would have brought them together at the same speed. The rebellion stayed scattered, present but never cohesive enough to become the existential threat that a fully realized Palpatine regime would have created. On Tatooine, Obi-Wan Kenobi waited in a small house in the desert, watching the horizon for a war that arrived in a different shape than he had expected. Luke Skywalker grew up on the moisture farm, eventually enrolled in the Imperial Academy the way half his friends did, served out his term, and came home without the universe dramatically requiring anything else from him. He had his father's instincts and no context for them. Leia Organa served in the Imperial Senate and met the Emperor at formal functions more than once. Each time she felt something she had no name for, a pull that was too specific to be coincidence and too familiar to be explained, that Bail Organa carried to his grave without ever giving her the key to understand it. Vader never knew them. The truth of who they were stayed buried under a galaxy that had shifted at one precise moment, and the children of Anakin Skywalker lived their lives in the long shadow of a father who never knew he was casting one. He ruled until the end. Not as a hero and not as the monster Palpatine had been trying to build, but as something the galaxy learned to live with because it was not quite terrible enough to die resisting. The historians who wrote about him afterwards struggled with the framing. He had destroyed both the Jedi and the Sith without intending to do either. He had ended a republic and built something that was still an empire, still built on the bones of a war and the blood of an order, but that had not turned its own people into the primary enemy the way Palpatine had always planned. It was not the life Anakin Skywalker had imagined for himself. Not even close. But it was a life. And for a man who had been left for dead on a black sand beach with no lungs and no limbs and nothing left, that was more than anyone had any right to expect. And the reason it happened at all comes back to something simple. Palpatine built Vader's suit to say one thing, every second of every day. You are broken, and you are mine, and you will never be anything else. It worked, until the day Palpatine ended up inside a machine of his own. Because the moment Vader could look at his master and see a man kept alive by a device just like him, the entire architecture of domination collapsed. You cannot make someone believe they are beneath you while you are breathing through the same kind of machine they are. The chain requires distance. Once the distance is gone, so is the chain. If you enjoyed this alternative timeline, hit that like button and subscribe for more Star Wars What Ifs. And may the Force be with you.